this morning. And this is the conclusion of the story about Joseph and the reunion with his brothers. And something in the story caught my eye because of experiences that I've had during the past week. And one of the things, I mentioned anxiety, which anxiety seems to be quite prevalent in our society today. And a lot of what creates anxiety is division and contention. And I think all of us are very upset, and rightfully so, over people actually dying in the middle of the contention. When you look at the story of Joseph getting back together with his brothers, one of the things that is incredible in the story is that as angry as people were, no one ends up getting murdered. Remember what God told Adam and Eve in the garden. He said, you can eat anything in the garden but this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He says, if you eat that tree, what will happen? You will certainly die. Did you notice in the story, from the moment that Adam and Eve partake in the fruit, and it's interesting, for some reasons, some people think it's an apple. The Jews think it was a fig. I have no idea what it was. But in the story of the Bible, from that moment on, we see violence. I mean, what happened between the first two brothers that were born? Cain kills Abel. And when you look at the story of Joseph, what were his brothers originally planning to do to him? They were going to kill him. And can you imagine in your mind, why would brothers want to kill their brother? And what is it in the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that made us die? Kaya.
I mean, there's a lot there, but one of the first things that came to my mind was shame. Because the first thing they recognized, they were naked, and they felt ashamed. In a certain sense, if you look at Joseph's brothers, there was a sense of shame when they weren't favored. And it starts all the way back with Cain and Abel because he was ashamed that God did not accept his offering.
That's a good point. No, that's a good... You hear what Kaya said, that shame plays into this, and you certainly do see that with Cain, and in the story, the brothers, there's shame, and then what often goes along with shame? Jealousy. And you look at the story of Joseph, I'm always amazed that Potiphar didn't kill Joseph. In fact, that Potiphar did not have Joseph killed has always made me suspicious that Potiphar did not believe his wife. Can you imagine at that time a servant accosting the lady of the house and not dying for it? In any case, Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph. His brothers almost do, but don't. They do throw him into a pit, and it even says they threw rocks down in there. I mean, there's a lot of violence in the story, and the story ends well, but there's a lot of pain that the actors go through before we get to the end. And so I've been thinking about that. The first judgment on the world, and I think you all know this. This is Genesis 6. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind, whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things, and the birds of the sky. For I am sorry that I have made them. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. We see this death that came into the world, and it says the world was filled with violence. And God responds by destroying it. He sees righteousness in Noah and his family, so he saves them. But how did Noah's descendants do in terms of violence? Not much better. By the way, do you know what the word is for violence in verse 11? It's Hamas. Now, you have to be careful because Hamas, the organization, it's a, what do you call it when you have letters? What's that? Acronym. An acronym. That's what it is. But it is interesting that Hamas in Hebrew is violence. And you all know the next verses I'm going to talk about, but I've been thinking about this. It's a little bit like our little exercise on anxiety. Has God given us a way to live where violence is not part of it? I don't think anybody here likes violence. And I think, when we mentioned, has anybody experienced anxiety? From the youngest to the oldest, we've experienced anxiety. We've experienced fear. In the Sermon on the Mount, remember what Yeshua says? He says, you heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder. We all know that. That's in the 10 Commandments. No murder is what the Hebrew says. And whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So can you see what Yeshua is doing here with murder? He's saying, in the law, in the Torah, it says that murder is answerable to the court. And actually, murder is a capital crime. But he goes on to say that when you're angry with your brother, when you call your brother names, that these are acts of murder. Have you noticed what's happened to our society today? According to the Sermon on the Mount, how often is murder committed in the media of today? And where does it, why do we allow this? Why do we enter into it? Obviously, we probably don't believe this. And then James asks, what's the source of the quarrels and the conflicts? And he says, it's your pleasures that wage war in your body's parts. He says, something inside of us. And he says, you lust and do not have, you commit murder. And that seems so strong because I think if I were to ask you, probably none of you ever here have ever wanted to murder somebody. Maybe for a moment. But I mean, you think about it, murder is a pretty serious thing. And most of us have very strong taboos, inhibitions against it. But as you go through the Bible, all through it, Genesis to Revelation, we are to respect other human life. Every human is made in the image of God, and yet we see this violence that surrounds us. And sometimes I don't think we realize that violence and murder are deeds of the flesh. So in other words, these are seeds that are planted in our hearts. They're planted in us, and we do something to allow them to grow and bear a harvest. And in our society today, we have a bumper crop of violence. And it's actually coming out now to where we see people dying. And when people die, You know what the first response we have is? It was not their fault, it was their fault. What's the response when somebody dies? It's grief. It's sorrow. Someone died. Everything has been put into a partisan lens, which, by the way, fans the flames of violence. It doesn't put them out. You know this one in Romans 12. I can hear my mom quoting this. In this translation, it says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. And I think the King James says, if it be possible, as much as it lieth in you, something like that. And then he goes on to say, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I think if you look at the story of Joseph, the anger of the brothers came very close to consuming the family. It came very close to act. What would have happened if they killed Joseph? How would you like to go through life knowing you had killed your brother? I mean, it's just, I think of things where it's accidental. I know I've told you the story. I had an uncle who his little niece just adored him, and he was just learning to drive, and his dad told him to go out to the garage and back the car out. And the little girl followed him, and he didn't know. And he ran over her head. He lived with that his whole life. He just passed away here just last month or two. Can you imagine if you kill out of anger, out of malice, there's something about the end of life which is so final, I guess is the word. It feels final. Couple things, and then we're going to look at some actual details. You probably know this by now, but I love my country, but I know the flaws in my country. And the United States of America has a violent spirit. We solve our problems with violence. That's how we started. And I don't know what it was, but it must have been funny.
I thought it was like a tea party.
Yeah, and the Tea Party led to violence, right? Does that happen all the time? Proverbs 15. I bet I can hear my mom saying this. A soft answer does what? But what? But harsh words stir up anger. And then this one in Ephesians, ridding yourself of falsehood. This is Ephesians 4. Speak truth with each one with his neighbor, because we are parts of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. What does it mean to give the devil an opportunity? It means, based on this passage, to give your anger a place where it grows, where you allow it to develop. What happened to Joseph's brothers? They experienced thousands of instances of their father favoring Joseph, Joseph tattling on them, Joseph having dreams where he was going to rule over them, Joseph wearing a coat of many colors. They had all these things, and how are they processing it? They were processing it in a way that it was giving the devil an opportunity. It was giving Satan a place. Do you ever do that? Do you allow that hurt in your life, the conflicts you have with other people, whatever it might be, do you give it a spot where it starts to grow? And I think that's what this is about. Teresa.
When I read that story, you think of life or whatever. Sometimes don't you wonder what the mothers said to their kids? Because I've where there's offense, but because parents or the other people in their life said, it's fine, it's discipline. It ended up not being lingering, where other people were, what they said to their kids made it 100 times worse.
Yeah.
Well, he was, when he was little, she was.
No. Well, I
I
mean,
mean, until Benjamin was born.
No,
But I
you,
mean, you wonder what.
I always
kids
wonder,
have to say about.
I always wonder why
I
the,
don't know, maybe she was saintly, but you wonder.
well, when you look at the boys, and I've talked about this many times, it's obvious to me that the strife between the four mothers came down on the children. There's just, how could it not? And so when you ask yourself, so how do we can't get up here and promise you will not be insulted. We can't promise you won't be hurt. We can't promise that you won't experience anxiety. None of that. The scripture is saying there's a way to live so that we don't give Satan a place. Because I've just visiting with somebody here this week, and they were recounting the violence that they had suffered in their lives. And you're just looking around this room. There are times we've been violent with each other. There are times we've hurt each other physically, sometimes emotionally, but we bear scars from violence. Joy, you had your hand up.
So in this exercise of writing stuff down, what I wrote down, which causes me a lot of anxiety, is what we're talking about. So one of the scriptures that I go to a lot, and I wrote it down, is Colossians 3:12. Since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourself with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony.
Yeah, that is an excellent one. But what Paul is saying there, he's outlining how we can keep Satan from having a foothold. And this unforgiveness thing. And when you look at the story of Joseph, it ends up beautifully because the brothers have changed. Joseph gives them a chance to show themselves. And then Joseph does not exact the retribution he could. Like that passage says, he makes allowance for their flaws. And in this case, their flaws were very dangerous to him. When you look at Israel's history, when you look at the Bible history, violence is everywhere. We don't only see it in the story of Joseph, but you look at when the kingdom split between Solomon's son Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The minute the kingdom split, what happened? The north and the south began fighting and killing each other. And the reason that they split is because they said, if you'll lighten our burden, we'll serve you forever. And he came back and said, I'm not going to lighten your burden. I'm going to make it hard. What's he doing? He wants a violence. There are things we can do that will trigger or produce violence. Here's a scripture that I think everybody knows, and it's looked at in ancient history as one of the first statements where people were looking forward to a day when there was no war. It will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go out from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So it goes on to tell us, what are his ways? He will judge between the nations, mediate for many peoples. They'll beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Come, house of Jacob, and let's walk in the light of the Lord. How many of you think you read that and it's a pipe dream? What is the chance of that with human nature the way it is right now? And yet, this is a prophetic word. That when God's word comes down from the mountain and his ways come to the people, they'll take their implements of war and make it into implements of cultivation, growing things. And Micah 4 says almost exactly the same thing. And then you turn around to Joel 3 and it's the opposite. It says, take your plows and make them into spears, because the day of judgment is coming. There's this tension that's there. Kaya.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does that line up with the other passages about the day of the Lord? Because I think it's Isaiah that says that he'll visit all the plagues, and including this one where their tongue shrivels up and they.
Zechariah.
Yeah, if they don't keep the feast and come up and come to Jerusalem in peace, if they don't do that, then they're going to be zapped.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at Zechariah 14, and not believing, when you get into eschatology, I admit it is not my best subject, even close. But it does talk about a day of separation between evil and good. And I think everyone knows that our lives are lives of warfare. We are fighting something. But the thing is, are we fighting violence or are we fighting with violence? And I'll just give you some, and Yeshua had these same tensions. Remember when he asked his disciples, do any of you have swords? Remember that? He says, if you don't have swords, go buy some. They said, we've got two. And he said, that's plenty. And then, a couple of days later, Peter pulls out his sword, and what does Yeshua say? He that lives by the sword will what? Die by the sword. There's the tension in it, because you do have to stand up for what's right. And I think, I'll spend a little time here now on the U.S. And I do believe we have a penchant for violence, and it seems connected, or it springs from our desire for independence, which is not a bad thing necessarily. But have you ever read the story of Canada and Australia, how they became independent? How long and hard did they fight England? And yet you look at the U.S., and India did not have a peaceful separation either. But I was curious, so I looked some things up. And I think you know this one. Right after the flood, the Lord comes to Noah and he says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And that seems like a little bit of a recipe for the killing going on until everybody's gone. But in the Revolutionary War, and these are statistics that, Teresa probably knows whether or not they're legitimate. On the American side, they figured about 6,800 men died in battle, but up to 17,000 from disease and exposure. All the things you go through in war. And over 8,000 were seriously wounded or maimed. Up to 8,500 British and their allies, Hessians, died in battle, and again up to 17,000 from disease and exposure. Those numbers don't sound huge, but they're pretty big. But the population of the U.S. was 3.6 million. What's the population of the U.S. today? It's 100 times that. It's 350 million, 360. Which means, for similar losses today, take every one of these figures and times it by 100. So if 6,800 men were killed in battle, what is that? 680,000. If it happened today. And I put that out to why did we have to solve our beef with Britain with violence. And there are probably people that would, it's obviously what happened, and so I can't fight with that. But the Civil War, we had another problem we couldn't solve: slavery. And there were other countries that outlawed slavery without having a civil war. In the Civil War, and I looked up this, and they're revising numbers all the time. I'd always heard about 600,000 people died. Well, now some historians have gone back and looked through the records, and especially they looked at the number of young men missing. You have an 1860 census, then an 1870 census. And they're somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 people died in the Civil War. Again, most of them not actually from battle. It's from disease, starvation, the things that carry out from war. One of the things I've noticed when you look at what's going on in the world today, and you look at all these places where there are battles, Ukraine is a good place to look at right now, and there are many others, Gaza. Do you have any idea what happens to the children that live through this? What are the chances a child will grow up watching people they know be blown up, killed? The anger, you talk about anxiety. What are the chances for these people to grow up and be, quote, normal? And I'm just pointing this out to say, in the end, does violence really solve anything? It's always a temporary fix. After World War II, I think a lot of people, and I kind of was one, thought Nazism was over. Is Nazism over? No, because you can't kill Nazism. It's a spirit. It's not, you kill every Nazi, there's that. And issues like slavery are tremendously important. I can see why something had to happen. But why do we decide the way to fix it is to kill each other? Have you ever heard about two men are out on the lake in a boat? And the one fellow notices the other man is doing something kind of suspicious. And he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat." He says, "You don't have to worry about it. It's not your business." But what's the problem? When you drill a hole in the bottom of the boat, we're both going to sink, right? And so these issues that are what I call hole in the boat issues, they concern all of us. And so it can move us to do drastic things. And our society faces a lot of those today. We do have a tendency in our country to solve things with violence. We're one of the highest murder rates in the world, though interestingly, the last couple of years, the murder rate is dropping significantly. And 2025 is one of the lowest murder rates. Let's see, I wrote it down here someplace. About 4 murders per 100,000 residents. I'm not sure is that good or bad? Why do we kill people? And where does it come from? What are the seeds we've planted? And I'm very impacted by real life experience. And Joy and I took a trip south, and we went and visited Jan and Dennis for an afternoon and drove around, saw things. And I kind of wanted to stop at the Mountain Meadows Massacre Monument. And I almost wish I didn't. There's a feeling in that place. How many of you have been there? Oh, you stand up on this hill and you look down. It's still a nice pasture area. It's a good place for cows and horses. But one of the most horrific mass murders in American history happened right there. And of course, I'm sitting there, I'm reading the things again, then I come home and read stuff. But what really grabbed me is that normal people did this. See, we forget that when we look at the Holocaust. Normal people did it. In fact, one of the Jews that was called to testify at the Nuremberg trials, when he came in and saw, I forgot which doctor it was. It wasn't Mengele, because I don't think they caught him. Whoever it was, he saw the man, he completely lost his composure and ran out of the room. And they said, what was wrong? Was just looking at all that evil? Just looking at that depth of wickedness? You couldn't. He says, no, I looked at him and he was completely normal. If we don't understand the capacity of the human being to indulge in violence, to follow the flesh, these are deeds of the flesh, we're doomed to repeat them. And so I was looking at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. There was about 120 people, and some of you know the history better than I do. It was two major families, the Fanchers and the Bakers, really quite wealthy farmers from Arkansas. And they had a party of people that were going through Utah, going to California. And at that time in Utah, there was a very great, what's the word I want here? Paranoia. That's just the word I want, of outsiders. Because they were being told that the U.S. Army was going to come in and invade Utah. And this fear was being fanned into flame in the people. And then as the party went through, it triggered a lot of jealousy because these people were wealthy. They had cows, they had horses. They weren't going to California to make a fortune. They were going into California to increase the fortune. These well-to-do people. That got going. And then stories started to spring up. Well, they're disrespecting Mormons, and they may have, I don't know. But then they started saying they'd poisoned wells, that it killed cows and even people. And the atmosphere of fear, the atmosphere of hysteria, then you start to tell the stories and you start to rehearse the conspiracies. And the people got together and they were so frightened and so angry, they decided to attack the wagon train. And of course, if you know the story, they disguised themselves as Indians, but not very well. And then a whole bunch of Paiutes helped them. There were hundreds of them. And one of the interesting things in the story as I read it, they attacked these people. And the first night they killed 6 or 7. And the party took all their wagons, of course, circled their group and chained the wheels of the wagons together to give them kind of a fortress. And then outnumbered by hundreds, being attacked, and they fought valiantly. And finally, someone, and it could have been John D. Lee, someone had the idea, let's tell them that we're offering them peace if they'll give us all their horses and cows. So they went into their camp with a white flag. They all agreed. Hostilities were over. And then as they led them in 2 groups, the men one group and the women another, they had prearranged signal. And at that signal, they shot and killed all the men and bludgeoned the women to death. Don't tell me when you go to that valley you can't feel it. It's evil. And they saved the kids by looking at them and deciding could they tell the story. So there's the 12-year-old girl standing there with other kids, and they shot her because they were afraid that she would be able to tell. And one of the reasons they decided to kill the whole group was in the early hostilities, they saw that some of the people had recognized them as white Mormons. And their fear was, we can't let anybody survive who knows who we were. This is very similar to stories in the Bible where David went to the camps of Amalek in the Philistine land and he'd kill every single person in the encampment so no one could say what he was doing. What is wrong with people? This all happened on September 11th, if you can believe it, of 1857. And it went on for 4 days. And, they went down and what they had told them, they said, we'll lead you to Cedar City, which is about 36 miles away. And then you go on your way and it'll all be over. And you ask yourself, how could people do something this horrible? And I would just say, look at, just as we have fruits of the Spirit, we have deeds of the flesh. What are you and I doing in our lives that increases the anger, the hostility, the violence? Because our society today is struggling with this again. We're ready to kill each other. And you know what? There's probably not much, if anything, worth killing people for. Something I thought was interesting when I looked at this story was that there was a widespread belief among those early LDS that in 1891, the kingdom of God was coming, the millennium, and so they didn't have to worry about the future. Not a good one. Do you ever see Christians going into this, the rapture's coming, so we don't need to worry about what we do now? That's a bad, bad belief with bad, bad fruit. If Yeshua is coming in the next second, that doesn't change how I want to live right now. If you go in and look at the whole story, and what's amazing, when they finally initially it was pawned off as an Indian attack, when people soon figured out that was baloney. Do you realize one man paid for this whole thing? One man didn't do it. There were hundreds. John D. Lee is the only one who paid for this. But that has really impacted me being there. And then I looked at what surrounds me, what surrounds us in our society, and I said, based on Isaiah 2, based on what Yeshua told us, the seeds coming from his followers should not be seeds of violence. They should not be seeds that want to destroy, to scorn, to hurt our enemies. In fact, we're told to love them, which really doesn't fit the Mountain Meadows Massacre very well. And yet, if you looked at those people when they did this, do you think they were convinced they were doing the right thing? Unfortunately, I think they did. And how many of you think they were angry? Anybody here ever done anything smart while you're mad? I'm a textbook case of it doesn't work for me. If I'm mad, I say and do stupid stuff. Galatians 5 says, the deeds of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, indecent behavior, idolatry, witchcraft, hostilities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambitions, dissensions, factions. What does this sound like? It sounds like people without God. It sounds like people that do give Satan a place. They do give him an area. And so I got thinking about this. the deeds of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit, they both come from seeds that are planted. What's the difference between the two? The deeds of the flesh are natural. Anybody here ever planted a garden and you look out there and you see your vegetables or your flowers coming up and you go, oh crap, there's no weeds.
That's a miracle.
What happens when you till the ground and you water it? Weeds come up. They're natural. But because you're a good gardener, what do? You yank the weeds out. You cultivate. You might even spray. You actively discourage the weeds so that the crop can grow up. And when you look at the fruit of the Spirit, it's no different. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are the 9. And I'm sure it's more than that. But they're things that have to be planted. They have to be, you put in good seed, you create an environment for them to germinate. That's what we were talking about this morning when we were looking at anxiety. How to create a place in my heart so God's Word will grow and I won't experience the anxiety that comes from thinking I'm God. Good soil, adequate moisture for growth, cultivation, weeding to give the crops their best chance, and time to reach maturity and production of fully ripened fruit. Important things in our life are not instant. There's nobody that has ever planted a seed and got up the next day and had ripe barley. Or transplanted an apple sapling into the ground and got up the next day and had apples. It takes time and takes careful husbandry and cultivation. Where God's people are today is in a place of learning to be patient with each other and asking the Lord for how do we create an environment where love, joy, peace, patience, kindness flourish. And one of the things that I think you will find in the deeds of the flesh, we don't have to teach people to be contentious or selfish. I remember watching our children, and our children were born wonderful and innocent, but just kind of. I still remember, and I think it was David and Kenneth, I'm not sure. Anyway, one of them was playing with his truck, but he had another truck he wasn't playing with. And so his brother came and said, "Can I play with that truck?" What was the answer? No. That's my truck. I promise you we did not give our kids a class in that. That was just natural. Greg, did you have your hand up?
And it kind of sparked something with me. In the charismatic world right now, there are several firestorms
Oh, a bunch of
going
them.
on in the charismatic world. We're talking about believers. And one of the crucial issues that they've encountered is accountability. Ministers and pastors and others being able to face some difficulties and being accountable for it. But the question came up where others are saying, well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you hold these people that were doing wrong things? Why didn't you hold them accountable? And I was curious what the answer was. The answer was, we didn't want to hold them accountable because somebody would point at us and say, well, you're doing the same thing. And that's a curious thing when you think about doing right and not doing right. We don't want anybody to examine us and hold us accountable. But we'll certainly hold somebody else accountable, saying, you should know better than that. We don't.
No, these things come together, don't they? Discerning between right and wrong, but knowing how to handle differences. And that's the thing that I've been very involved in watching what's going on in the charismatic movement right now, and and some of it is, what's the word? We don't want to get involved. And the other side of it is there's definitely a thing that says, I don't want you to check on me, so I'm not going to check on you. But there's also this anger that we see here in our culture. I mean, I'm sure you have to live under a rock not to see what's happening right now between those who favor removing illegal immigrants, those who are opposed to it, everywhere in the middle. And really, they're pretty good points on both sides. But the thing I'm noticing is the anger. And the anger will get us. No one is realizing that. You see, we think it's the left doing it. We think it's the right doing it. We don't understand that our adversary is a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And right now, both sides are getting devoured because they don't understand at the end of the day, we're still going to be Americans. Just like in the church, we're still going to be Christians. And one of the things I've noticed when we have problems, like, Greg mentions, typically what we've handled when people don't do things right is we say, well, that person isn't really a Christian, and we put them outside the fold. And the problem is, usually they are. Usually they are brothers and sisters that need to be brought into some kind of discipline. And if they won't, like Paul says, warn them twice. But I think about this quite a bit, and going down to Mountain Meadows massacres is very impactful for me because I look there and I see this peaceful, beautiful agricultural landscape and realize the carnage that happened there. And people, can you imagine shooting a 12-year-old girl because you're afraid she might be able to tell people what happened? Telling you that probably they weren't proud of what they were doing. We can't fix that. That's in the past. How do we live today so that somehow in our fellowship, in each one of us, we see the fruit of the Spirit growing up? We see peace. And it's easy to keep peace when it's peaceful. The challenge is to keep peace when it's not peaceful. There's a story in the Bible that you all know. And it's a good story of this anger and whatever. You remember Nebuchadnezzar built this huge gold statue? And everybody in the kingdom, they had this, it's fun to read it because it talks about all these different instruments and the different songs, and these list of 10 things has to happen, then everybody's to bow down. Well, they went through that list of things, the psaltery, the harp, the announcements. Everybody bowed down except there were 3 men standing there. So Nebuchadnezzar said, well, they must not have understood. We do it again. They're still standing there. Nebuchadnezzar has a temper, or he actually lacks one. He blows his stack. There's an interesting idiom for you. But so he has his men fan the flames of the furnace to such an intense heat that it kills them. And it's such a picture of what anger does. Does Nebuchadnezzar care about his men that die? Not the least. And the men that now take the 3 and throw them into the fire, it kills them. And after a while, Nebuchadnezzar is able to get close enough to look. And what does he see in the fire? He sees 4 men. That's a very significant story in many ways, but the thing that really struck me as I thought about that story, when we get faced with the turmoil and the anger and the fighting, the violence, we have to be careful that we don't let that fire touch us, and that we make sure we remember there is a 4th man with us. Because if our focus is on that 4th man, whatever the fire does, it isn't going to destroy us. And I also have to say this, without the 4th man, we will be destroyed. We absolutely need a Savior. Let's stand. Sister Robin, would you close for us, please?
Our Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this day and this opportunity to get together and to be fed with your word. We ask you to be with those